Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Tree.Church Bible Study, and I am really excited to be with you today. My name's Chris, and I'm the Director of Biblical Education here at the Tree, and today we are going to be kicking off a new study. So we just finished off the Corinthians, so we went through 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and now we're going to be jumping into the book of Ecclesiastes, which may be one of the most underread books, maybe the most misunderstood books.
Sure.
Also, maybe the most depressing books that we've ever gone through. And so I'm excited to get into it, and I'm excited to talk about it. I think we were talking about it a little bit ahead of time, and just the sobriety and the reality it brings into focus through the biblical literature. And so we're going to talk about it all here in a second. But before we do, let me introduce you guys. I'm really glad to be with you today. Today we have Micah Hegerly with us. And Micah, glad to have you on a podcast
Good
again.
to be here. Yeah.
So always enjoy the wisdom and insight you bring into this. So thanks for coming back. And then also Anthony Lombardi. Anthony, how you doing today?
Doing great, man. Excited to talk about this.
Awesome, man. Glad to have you back and really excited to get into this. So before we do that, got some random questions. And I don't know, man, last time I asked random questions, I was like, there's no way this actually ties into the podcast. And Micah actually brought it into the podcast. And I was like,
Here we go.
So yeah, here we go. We're going to see how this plays out. See, can Micah bring it into the podcast, even though they're the two most random questions?
Can he do it, folks? Can he do it?
Love it.
So, all right. So the first question is, what is the coolest feature you would put into your dream house? And Anthony, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, so we briefly touched on this before. So I would do not an office, a study. So like an old school looking study with a sweet desk. We talked about it before. A library with it, so lots of books. I think I would even like to have one of those the moving ladders, on the bookshelves.
I was just going to say
also, I think I would want it to be secret. So it would be like a cabinet door where you open up and then you walk into the study somewhere. So that would be, for me, that would be ideal. That'd be awesome.
Love it. I would go with a movie theater, just a place that has stadium seating and just a comfortable place to watch movies. I don't know. I think that'd be great for the family, all that stuff. So
that's awesome.
Movie theater.
Yeah, I want both of those. So, but my original answer was exactly what Anthony said. I want a 2-story one, like a 2-story study that has books on every wall. If you ever, this is a cartoon, so I don't know if you've ever watched Beauty and the Beast, and that room they dance in, where there's books just all along the wall, and like a glass pane window on the one end that just let natural light in, big mahogany desk and stuff like that.
I think I've literally said that to Makara, when we were watching the movie. I'm like, I want that.
Yeah. I don't need the big chandelier. I want a little bit. No. I want a little bit darker colors on the wall, the wood paneling and stuff like that. So, but that would be sweet.
Yeah. Just the aesthetic of it is just incredible.
Yeah.
It just makes you feel wise being in there.
I don't want to read the books. I just want the aesthetic of being in there.
I just want to look smart.
Yeah, exactly. So now that we've approached my shallowness, so let's talk about something else. What is the worst hair decision you've ever made?
Man.
And I hope we don't offend anybody on.
It's interesting that you would ask this question.
Why?
Why?
What are you saying?
I don't know.
What are you getting
I'm not saying anything. When I was in high school, I hated taking care of my hair, so I actually shaved it completely off, bicked it, razor all the way off.
Yeah?
Yeah. It was terrible.
Worst mistake you've ever made?
Worst mistake ever. I need to enjoy it while I have it.
Yeah. You might one day look like me. So
this is a funny story. It's really not a story actually, but I got voted best hair my senior year. But what is funny is prior to that, I had the swoosh hair. So this was technically before Justin Bieber, but it was a little bit of that where it was some would have called it emo hair, but not
brushed over.
Not the extreme when you think of emo hair.
Didn't cover an eye.
No, but it was always So my friends joked and they would call me Flicka because I would always go like this and to get my hair out of my face. So looking back, there was some seasons where it was shorter than others and it actually looked really good. But there was a couple years, my sophomore year, it was so long. And I look at some of those pictures now and I just laugh. I'm like, man, I don't know why I thought that looked good.
So you basically started the trend though. Bieber took it from you?
Yeah, I mean, probably. But
that's cool. Not a big deal.
There was a phase that I hit that was I think I was a junior or senior, and I just was into skating. I was into punk music, all that stuff. So it wasn't the bowl cut, but I had longer hair, and you would shave up underneath. So everything underneath was shaved, and it was long on top, so it would just kind of hang over the shaved part. That was a mistake. And then I also put sun in it, so it turned my hair orange. Oh man, it was rough.
That sounds rough.
Do you have photo evidence?
Oh, I do.
Yeah, we need
my
to
senior
see that after
pictures.
this.
My senior pictures were that way. So
Speaking of bowl cut, though, I honestly don't know how anyone has ever thought, let's do this. You know what I mean? Like, this looks great. Nobody in the history of the world has ever thought that or said that. So the question is, why would you do it?
I'm not going that far because I'm going to walk in on Sunday, somebody's going to have it, and then they're going to listen to this podcast, and I'm going to be like, eh.
I will tell you
the
this:
cut.
some of the younger generation now, you start to see it's not the bowl cut, but it's like the flare out, and it kind of looks like the
Has a
mushroom,
little bit of that,
top look to it, which is not quite the bowl cut, but it's kind of trending in that direction.
Yeah, they have like all the hair like up
Everything
front.
comes in cycles, right?
It really
Style,
does.
and so like
Yeah.
I won't be surprised if 10 years down
Yeah.
the road people have bowl cuts again.
Yep.
Favorite haircut.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, guys.
That's right. We're
gonna talk
well
about-
done, man.
Dang it, Micah.
Well done.
That was way too fast.
Got it.
So,
Transition there.
oh man. What about favorite haircut? I know that's not on there, but
I would say my current one. I've
like
had this
your
one for a while, so
right.
I'm always like scared. We were just talking about this in the office this morning. Like I'm scared to like do something that somebody will like something drastic that people will notice right away, to like draw attention. So I just keep everything the same as much as possible.
like you like to fly under the radar, don't
I
you?
do. Yep.
Yeah.
So I had something similar to this hairstyle when I was like younger, probably like 6 or 7. I remember going to the barbershop. They called it the Princeton, which is so funny when you think about like why they would call it the Princeton. But I think it looked better on me then than it does now. So like when I look back at this picture, I was like, man, I was a handsome little guy with my hair, combed over.
So
and,
same haircut, just different season.
yeah,
of your
different
life.
season of life for sure.
Yeah. All right. So, like I said, I loved punk music. I loved all that. Like my favorite hairstyle that I had, I was probably a sophomore in college, and I could never get like. So I was always dyeing my hair. I was always trying different things. I could never get like color the way that I wanted it to. And my aunt finally got my hair to the place where like she got it bleach blonde, and I mean I was like blonde. And so like it was almost white, and so like she finally got it there, and I was able to dye my hair blue, like, and I'm talking like royal blue, like the color of your. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but the color of your cup there, and so like I loved it.
That's
and, like,
wild, man.
Like I was in a punk band at the time, and so like it was my thing. And
I've
then
never colored my hair ever. Have you?
I've never. No, I used to be just naturally be bleach blonde, like
so
almost
wild.
white.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's just
Man.
changed.
well, I think we figured out the common denominator here and what happened into my hair. So like, it's
That's why you have
probably
your hair, just all the chemicals over the years.
multiple years of cheap chemical dyes
man.
on my head has.
Hey, that's good wisdom for people.
There you go.
Don't do that.
All right,
Got
now, all
it.
right.
Okay.
Well, so these jokes keep happening because we're talking about Ecclesiastes, and we are going to be getting into what is traditionally called wisdom literature. So, though this is traditionally called wisdom literature, it's actually a newer concept. So, when we look at the Bible, there are certain books in the Bible that get classified under this type of literature, and it's a newer classification. It's just a way of kind of classifying these books that are typically associated with Solomon. They're typically they're kind of when we think of like Proverbs and they're so like proverbial in nature, maybe even focused on wisdom. The funny fact though, like one of the things that I heard is that the books of that are considered wisdom literature all have a female lead character in it. So like Esther actually in Hebrew Bible gets lumped in with that. So like all of these writings have this idea of like lady wisdom, like of a female protagonist in it. So like it's kind of cool how they kind of group it. Wisdom literature is not a genre, if you understand what that term is, but it doesn't get its own classification that way because there's like poetry within it, there's like prose within it. So like you get all these different types of writing within wisdom literature, but this is just a way of describing this level of like proverbial, like really focusing on the idea of wisdom. So as we get ready to talk about like how to read wisdom literature, because we're going to spend the next 10 to 11 weeks talking about Ecclesiastes and talking about the wisdom that it provides, let's first just start off by, as we think about reading wisdom literature, how would we define wisdom? And then how do we, what is its importance? I'll say it that way. Like, why is it so important that we seek wisdom?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the most talked about things in Scripture is this idea of wisdom. And for a long time, like I thought wisdom was more knowledge, like it was being smarter. But like as you read it more, like you understand the heart behind it, and just like understand that this is alignment with God's heart for your life. And so like a lot of the things in Proverbs and wisdom type writings is like these really practical things that God calls us to as we grow in our obedience. But it's actually like that living out of your faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that we're going through this series, on holiness, and have the podcast talking about holiness. I think there's a lot of alignment even with wisdom and holiness.
Yeah.
Like the concept of living a holy life is also to live a wise life, because I would agree with Micah. It is aligning not only your heart, but your actions, your lifestyle with God's design and purpose for human flourishing. I've always heard it really described, I can't take credit for this, but knowledge is having right information. Wisdom is applying that right information to the right situation. So I think one of the pitfalls that we often see in our current society is that we have access to so much information, right? So in some sense, you have a lot of people that are knowledgeable or think they're knowledgeable, but that's different from wisdom. And wisdom is more significant because you can have a lot of knowledge and not do the right things, right? And so your life ends up experiencing all kinds of problems and stuff. So you might be a smart person, you might know a lot of good things, but if you're not applying that to the right situations in the right ways, you're not going to reap the benefit that I believe God really does desire to you, for you to experience human flourishing.
Yeah, and you guys have mentioned this idea of knowledge versus wisdom, and knowledge is a part of wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Knowledge is essentially the ascertaining of facts, you know what I mean, or information. But wisdom really stems into this moral idea. So wisdom has this idea of how do we know right from wrong? How do we know what creates the best life? You know what I mean? And so like what I love is as I was looking and studying, like getting ready for this podcast, we have this classification of wisdom literature, but really in reality, the entire Old Testament, kind of like what you said, the entire Bible is wisdom literature. And then what it's setting up is this idea of there are two ways to find, or I shouldn't say two ways, but there are two thought processes at work always when someone is approaching life and when they're trying to figure out what is the right way to go, what is the good path and what is the bad path or the evil path, for lack of better terms. And in the study of this, like something that I was brought back to and I was kind of constantly reminded of is that this idea and this concept starts in Genesis 3. And it's the idea of Adam and Eve standing before the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the question that they're posed with, or the dilemma that they're posed with, is who will they trust for the knowledge to be the people that they're supposed to be, to be the people that God calls them to be? Will they ascertain that knowledge by eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or will they do it by obeying the commands of God, obeying the command of God? And so like that is the idea, and that is the picture that is put in front of us in this what's called wisdom literature. It's just a reminder of there are two paths that we can go to find wisdom. One is to either obey God, and the other is to try to ascertain it ourselves, or try to gain it ourselves. So let me ask this question. What are some ways that we are told that we can gain wisdom? I mean, I revealed the dichotomy, but like, let's talk about that a little bit and let's flesh that out. Like, what are ways that we're told that there is wisdom, and why is it important that we hit the nail on the head and we get wisdom right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, Proverbs starts off, and it says it multiple times, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I think that, like, even that concept needs to probably be addressed and talked about. Like, number one, I remember I had a friend several years back. He didn't know a lot about the Bible. We have a lot of conversations around Christianity. And I think it was him and I don't know if it was his wife at the time or girlfriend, they had this conversation about, like, should you fear God? And I think what they were wrestling with is like, okay, if God is good and loving, that seems weird. Like the concept of fearing God seems almost contradictory. But I think, and you guys can add into this, but I think when I understand the fear of the Lord, it is this reverential respect, realizing that God is God and you are not. And so It's putting him in his rightful place and putting yourself in your rightful place in living in light of that reality. So I think that's the beginning, realizing if I'm not God, if I didn't create myself, then why would I trust myself to think I know what's best for my life and I know what's best in any given situation? So it makes sense to me if that's what the fear of the Lord is, it makes sense that's why it would be the beginning of wisdom, because it realizes God's ways are better than mine. He's the creator. He is Lord over all. I'm not, so I'm going to submit my life under his rule and reign.
Yeah. And I think that's the hardest part, because it takes incredible humility to enter into any space like that, to say, I don't know everything. Like, internally, I can't muster up this wisdom. And so I need other voices speaking in. Ultimately, God's voice is that ultimate voice. But also, like, relying on people who have walked further in life than you have too, that have walked with Jesus longer, and just like, I need to gain that wisdom every day from people who are older than me and have walked through things that I'm about to or have yet to enter into.
Yeah, and humility really embodies the idea of trust. And it brings us back to the place of, like, and if you think about the story in Genesis 3 and what's posed before Eve, and the temptation to her is, God has called you to fulfill this calling on earth. He's called you to rule the earth, to dominate. Dominate is not to, but to rule the earth and kind of fill it.
Have
and
dominion over it.
Have dominion. That's the word I was looking for. But he's called you to do this, but he's limited you from the tools that you need by not letting you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He's withholding something.
Sure.
Can you trust him in the calling that he's put on your life? And that is that's the temptations before Adam and Eve. And that's the temptation, if we're honest with ourselves, that's the temptation before each one of us every time we wrestle with, will I go God's way, or will I go the way that I think is best for ascertaining this wisdom or life?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of one of the Proverbs. Again, if we're going to say, if it's one book that people were going to say was, hey, this is wisdom literature, right? It's Proverbs, as you said earlier. Right. But the idea of there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is death.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, that embodies what we're talking about here, this struggle of, like, we so oftentimes feel like, or we think we know what we want to do, or what we should do, or what's right, or what's going to ultimately lead us to a life of happiness. But ultimately, it is opposed to what God really desires and has designed us for. And so that is the tension that we constantly walk in is, am I going to trust myself? Am I going to trust, on the opposite of what you said, other voices who are not ultimately embodying God's wisdom and God's way of life, but are other voices, which this is something that I think is just pertinent to all of us, because we're bombarded on a daily basis with so much social media. There's so many other voices out there, so many other alternative ways of living, and hey, this is what you need to live the best life. So we're constantly being bombarded, by that. So we ultimately, at the end of the day, have to make this decision, whose voice am I going to listen to? Am I going to listen to my own voice? Am I going to listen to God's voice? Am I going to listen to the voices of the people out there who currently have the most influence in Hollywood or social media? And I think it does come down to who knows what is right, what is good, what is best, and what is the best life even look like?
Yeah. Well, as we get into this is all great. And I really think we're really shaping the conversation for what Ecclesiastes is going to set up. Now, we've talked about the Proverbs, and Proverbs shares a similar kind of mindset, like similar topics that we're going to be talking about. But at times when we read Proverbs, when we sit down and we're reading wisdom, what we say is wisdom literature. I'm just going to use that term because I think it just kind of clarifies it. There at times when we sit down and read it, we think like, okay, so Proverbs says, if I do this, then this will happen. I think the temptation is, and this is called the theory of retribution, or retributive theory is the best way. Yeah, I said the same thing, just reversed it. So, but just trying to explain this idea of, like, if I do this, then this happens. And at times, I think when we sit down, we read like Proverbs and we read wisdom literature, we go, if I can just do these 5 steps, then this result will happen.
Sure.
And the wisdom literature always creates a tension. So Ecclesiastes, as we get into it, you're going to see creates a tension. And the book of Job, honestly, because it's also piled into that wisdom literature, like, it creates this tension that maybe things are a little bit more complex than this formulaic idea. If I can just do these 5 things, everything will work out well.
Sure.
So can you guys think of examples where this idea of retribution or this retributive theory, where that doesn't play out?
Yeah, I think just personally, like we grew like all of us are in this performance minded culture where you do something, you get something, you do something well, you get praise for that. But like following Jesus, like he promises us that we will have trouble. Like we're not, it's not going to be easy, but he has overcome the world. So there is like this promise of like, we have to pick up our cross daily and follow him. Like it's not going to be easy. And just like having that mindset of like, not everything I do is going to be to just benefit myself. And just knowing that God has that further sight down the road, knowing that like, like right now there might be conflict, but if you're handling it in a wise way, he sees the outcome before we even do. And just like trust, like it goes back to that trust part of like, I don't have it in of myself to figure this out and to walk in a wise way. So,
well, I think it brings it back to what you were saying earlier. Like, how do we define what the good life is? You know what I mean?
Like, even like what wisdom is, right? If, based on what I said, my definition, and people might disagree with that, and that's okay. But the idea of like applying the right knowledge to the right situation, there is some standard, like objectively, of what that actually means and what that actually looks like, right? Like if the world is designed to work in a certain way, then it's a part of the struggle of our culture is like, Pastor Matthew has been saying this, the idea of kind of this ongoing experiment. And it is to a degree, because if you don't initially submit to the idea that God is the creator and sustainer and ruler over all, and ultimately he is the dispenser of all truth, well, then you're left to your own devices to try to figure out through experimentation of like, we have to figure out what works best, what leads to human flourishing. So I do think that that's always the tension. I really like what you said, though. I think one of the issues with wisdom and this concept of retribution, and really a lot of times I think in society we would almost hear it as the term like karma, right? If you do good, good comes back to you. That kind of, it's very much a lot of the new age thought today, how we would communicate that. But I love what you said, because there's an element of this as far as Christianity goes where the primary means of doing this is not, or the primary reason for doing this is not to get something necessarily out of it. Like that may be the byproduct. But if we love God, if we want to honor him, to me, that is the first and foremost thing. I want to glorify God. I want to honor him. So I think the motivation has to be right. I think as far as the question goes, one of the examples that I think of, and this is a very painful one for a lot of people. So Proverbs talks about, right, if you train up a child in the way he should go, when he's old, he will not depart from it.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of people who have not experienced the reality of that, in that they have loved their children, they've raised them in a godly home, they've brought them to church, they've discipled them, taught them. And, when their kid is 22 years old in college, they deconstruct and they're no longer a Christian. Now, that's not to say that, 20 years from now, they might not come back to the faith. But I think there's a lot of people living in that tension where they look at a scripture like that and they say, I did what I was supposed to do. And then there's a wrestling of like, did God fail me? Did God not keep his promise? So I think there is a tension that needs to be worked out. If we see this almost as only a formula, absolutely, that would shake your faith, rather than it's just kind of the conversation of there are rules and then there are exceptions to the rule. We live in a fallen world. We should still do that. We should still seek to raise our kids in a godly home. But at the end of the day, there is that reality of they might not choose to follow Christ. They might be influenced in another way. They might make wrong decisions. So it's not this, absolute guarantee. If I do these things, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I love the book of Job for it, because it speaks to kind of it's very pointed to what you just said, because it gets into that place of like, I've done all these things right. What's going on? Yeah, and I really do think the biblical wisdom and it deals with the real complexities of life because of working in a fallen world. And it brings us back to this place of, will we trust that God's commands make sense even when it appears like they're not working? And I think that is the tension that Ecclesiastes, and all of the wisdom literature is going to put before us is, will we trust that the fear of the Lord really does bring life, even when it doesn't look like it's coming together?
Yeah, so, absolutely. I think of, real quick, John 6, it's this idea where, Peter and the disciples, like the rest of the disciples kind of walk away after the hard teaching of Jesus, and they're wrestling with that. And Jesus is like, are you going to go too? And Peter kind of says, well, where else are we going to
Yeah.
go? You know what I mean? Like, and I think there's an element of that in wisdom too. It's like, what's the alternative? I've realized, and I can only speak for myself, but I've realized how foolish I am when I try to do life by my own design,
Yeah.
that it never ends up going the way that I want it to. And so 10 times out of 10, I would rather trust God, even if the initial result is not what I hoped for, not what I wanted. I can ultimately entrust my life to myself and make a mess of it, or I can trust my life to God that even in the highs, even in the lows, He is still working in that. He is still doing something. And even if it doesn't work out the way that I want to, I can live with a clean conscience knowing that I've trusted God through and through the good and through the bad.
Yeah, 100%. All right, so now we've talked about wisdom literature as a kind of a whole. Now we're going to kind of narrow it down, and we're going to get into kind of the nitty-gritty of Ecclesiastes specifically. And before we jump into verse 1 here, because we're going to get into 1:1 here and start processing through it, but just as we get into Ecclesiastes, just to kind of set it up and to get our minds in the right place with where this is going, I want you to imagine the book of Ecclesiastes is going to be kind of like going to a funeral. And everybody's like, super, wonderful. And what I mean is like, so when you go to a funeral, and I don't know if you guys are this way, and maybe it's different for you, but every time I go to a funeral or every time I do a funeral, it is a sobering moment. Yeah. It is a shock to the system, a wake-up call, or a step out of my everyday reality where I am reminded of the brevity of life, the reality of death, and it makes you stop and come back, like step back and just take a look of, does my life embody the values that I say are really valuable to me, the things that are really valuable to me, and do they really have ultimate value? Will they really produce what I'm hoping for in the end of my life? And so that is what Ecclesiastes is going to do. And so you're going to hear very sober-minded themes reoccur over and over and over again, and you're going to be like, have you guys ever seen the Snickers commercials where where it's Betty White like running around playing a sport, and they give the person a Snickers and it transforms them into their normal selves? Like, so it's going to be one of those moments. It's almost like you should have eaten a Snickers. You know what I mean? Like, get the guy a snack. You know what I mean? So. And so like that's kind of the thought, and so you're just gonna have to kind of this next few weeks, these next few months, as we look at this, just as an audience, just prepare yourself for, we're gonna dive into and challenge you with some very sober thinking, and I would invite you to jump into it and embrace it. No, it's not the most joyful thing all the time, but let it be what it's meant to be. It's meant to give us that perspective shift, if for lack of better terms. So, all right, I'm gonna jump into the first verse, and I typically I do like author, like we talk about author, we talk about all of those kind of background details. The book kind of introduces it, so I'm gonna jump in and kind of explain that, and then once we get into verse 2, we'll start talking a little bit about the main theme of the book of Ecclesiastes. So, verse 1: these are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem. All right, so right away we get a picture of who this is who is doing the speaking, who is addressing this. And typically what's traditionally taught is that Solomon is the source of this literature. Now, if you read, it doesn't exactly say that. The Hebrew word there is not Solomon's name, and there's some vaguity, ambiguity, that's the word.
You just made up a word.
I just made up a word, yeah.
I like that.
Vaguity. There's ambiguity as to which of David's sons, who is king, that the book that is the teacher. And so while Solomon is associated, and you're meant to think of Solomon while we're reading this, it doesn't necessarily mean that he wrote this literature, but you're to think about his life and who he is. And really, it's really meant to be ambiguous for the purpose of bringing every king in light of this literature. All the kings were the term that's used there is kohelet. So that is the Hebrew word, and that is actually the name of the book in Hebrew. We don't find out that it's Ecclesiastes until it's translated into the Septuagint, which is a Greek Old Testament, and what they called it was Ecclesiastes, and it's based off of this word, this word kohelet, and it means gatherer. And so like it's the person who's leading an assembly. So the idea of king works really well there, but it's someone who is bestowing wisdom and reflecting on life as the leader of Israel and as the person who gathers the nation and is trying to instruct them. So if you hear us talking and we don't say Solomon's the writer, that's what we're trying to get at. There's some ambiguity to it, and it's meant to be a broader picture than just his life. Though there are going to be things that we will talk about Solomon and his life in it, because it is meant to bring that to mind. So, but Kohelet is our focus, the teacher, the preacher. And this is what he's going to say, and this is what he has to say to us in verse 2, and here starts the cheeriness. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. Now, this word, let's just break this down for just a second.
This is the thesis statement of the entire book.
Yeah,
right?
It's the thesis statement for the entire book, and he starts it this way. Like, what does that say to you guys? I didn't give you this question ahead of time, but like as you hear that, where does your minds go with that? Like,
I just think about the things that I put weight into in my life that, in the end, like don't draw me closer to God. You know, like whether that be worrying about like what show I'm watching or what kind of car I drive. You know, these things that culture says, man, these are important things to keep up on.
You just shot your dream.
I know, yeah. But in the end, like you take a step back and you look at those things and you're like, they don't truly add value to my life, to my soul, to who I am in Christ. And so in that sense, yeah, everything of this world is meaningless. But then you like flip it around and be like, well, God didn't create anything unintentionally in this world.
Right.
And so you like start to kind of, it's the kind of the muddy waters of vanity and what is vanity.
Sure.
Yeah, I think for me, especially knowing the rest of the book, I think it's this idea of human striving is meaningless, in that so often we do get caught up in kind of building our own world and our own empires. And, you know, as we're going to get throughout the book, like over and over again, especially when you think if this is Solomon, or even if it's just based on Solomon's life, someone who had experienced every single pleasure to the fullest extent in this world, is still wrestling with this sense of, you know, emptiness, or what is the purpose of all this? So I think there's an element of this that also resonates with every human being, in that we've all done things, we've all had hopeful aspirations, and many of us have maybe arrived there and yet felt disappointed, let down. We've done all the things that we're supposed to do, the things that everyone says these are the most important things, and still been left, you know, wanting. And so I think there's an element of this that not only is it's sobering, as you said, where we really need to take a step back and say, what are the things in my life that I am pursuing and going after that are meaningless in the end, right? If I have eternity in mind as the end goal, what are all these things that I'm anxious about, I'm stressed about, I'm so focused on, I'm so obsessed with, that really don't matter in the end?
Well, and I think about the narrative. So as you said that, like I think about the narrative that's kind of sold to our culture, to our young people. Like I'm constantly, my son is 18 years old. He's working on like, what is my purpose in life? Like, what is my calling? Which I think are great questions. Like, I think are important questions. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? And there is this idea and this mindset that gets thrown out there is this, and Pastor Michael has said this before. So I'm not trying to claim something that I'm making up that's not mine. He said this idea is like, we hear this saying that do something you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And he's like, that's not true. He's like, even the best job ever has days where it gets boring, has days where it's hard work, has days where there are things and elements of it that you like, you just don't want to do. And it really does bring out to light this unsatiable desire inside of us. And I think it takes it back to the Holy Podcast. What are we doing when in our search for life if we don't have something to lead and guide it that other than we're experimenting and trying to find the thing that will satisfy that ache inside of us. And that idea of meaningless, I want to jump into that because there are going to be key words that we focus on and we think about and we look at through this entire study. And so like when I sent this out to the host, I sent all the Hebrew words because I think it's so rich. And sometimes the English does it justice, sometimes it doesn't. So the idea of meaningless is good. Some of the translations use meaningless. This is the NLT, so it used meaningless. Vanity is another one that gets thrown in there, and vanity is this idea of like just there's just not much to it. I've heard the term I've heard it explained like mist, like nothing of substance. But then as I was studying the idea and the context that gets thrown in with this word, and the word is hebel, like it is the word that's used for meaningless, and it's this idea of nothing is profited or nothing is gained. So like it is that like I've really worked hard for all of this, and there's no profit for it in the end. You know what I mean? And nothing is gained from it. Now, he goes on, and and we're going to see these examples even later on. He's going to talk about things we would say are very good things, and the things that we should be working for.
Sure.
And so how can he say that it's meaningless? And how do we work out of this tension that he's going to say, let's speak to the tension that we're talking about. There's the reality of God does value things, but they still profit nothing in the end in some way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean, we just have to keep coming back to our purpose as human beings to love God and to love people. And like anything that we do that does not set us up to do that well, that's meaningless. Yeah. But culture says that anything that we do that promotes ourselves, makes ourselves look good, builds us up, like that's our true, that's what we should go after. That's what we should strive after. But I think the reason that this is so hard for us as human beings is because it's so counter our own desires and our own feelings.
Yeah, I would say the way that I would describe it is holding things with an open hand or holding things loosely. And what I mean by that is, so for example, I think most of us here and most people maybe have a television series they like to watch or movies they like to watch. But in the scope of life and the purpose of life, is watching Netflix really that conducive towards anything that has any real value? Probably not most of the time. I mean, we might be inspired by something, or there might teach some truth. But for most of us, you're watching to be entertained. So I think for me, as a Christian, I can hold these things loosely and say there's enjoyment in certain things, but in the scope of eternity, this is not what my life is about, nor should my life be in constant pursuit or built around this. I can enjoy these things with an open hand at any moment, give it back to God and say, Lord, if you wanted me to stop doing this right now or took this away from me right now, I'm fine. And I think that gets more difficult as things get more precious to you, like your wife, your children, those types of things. But I mean, Abraham is a primary story, like the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? That idea of giving his own son,
the most precious thing to him.
Yeah. Now, of course, and Pastor Matthew just talked about this Monday in Staff Church, but just that concept of like, are you willing to hold everything loosely before God? It doesn't mean that you can't enjoy it. It doesn't mean that you can't experience hints of joy. I always call it like the shadow of joy, right? I think it's C.S. Lewis who kind of talks about that concept, right? But that these things ultimately point to a greater reality. So they're not meant to be fixated on. They shouldn't become an idol. They should be held loosely, enjoyed, but realized in the moment or in the scope of eternity that they are meaningless.
Yeah. And that book, the book of Ecclesiastes, this is the main theme because it is the main tension that it wants to present us. And he is going to go on. So he's going to say things later on in the studies and that other people are going to present here, like not this one particularly, but like in the later weeks as we process through the book, you're going to hear things like wisdom. You're going to hear things like being the most righteous, like striving to be the most righteous even. Like things you're like, well, isn't that what I'm called to do? You know what I mean? Like, isn't that what God wants? He's gonna say things like that you're going to go, man, I thought that's what I was supposed to be striving for. You know what I mean? And so there's this tension that's created because if you go to the very end, he finishes off, and the narrator finishes off the book. So the middle book, this verse 2 through whatever is the teacher speaking. Verse 1, and you get towards the end of the book, it's a narrator kind of giving some insight into almost commenting on how the teacher speaks. And the narrator comes back, and he almost just gives this mild corrective. He says, live in this tension of how even the good things can end up pointless. But live in this tension of the true end of man is to fear God and obey his commandments, to love God and love people. So you guys have really been speaking to that. But so that is what we're doing in this book. We're wrestling with those ideas of stepping back and gaining that perspective on what is really to be valued in our lives and what really truly profits in the end. All right, so let's pick up in verse 3, and we're going to keep going on, and we'll actually read to the end of our section today, and we'll talk a little bit about what he's going to say here. He says, "What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. The water returns again to the rivers and flows out to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description." You can almost hear him as he's saying it. He's like, everything is just cyclical, and it's never satisfying. It never profits anything. And he's like, how wearisome is that this has been going on for eternity, essentially, or since the creation, essentially. So no matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are never content. History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Sometimes people say, here's something new, but actually it's old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
So encouraging.
So, yeah, he drives home his point very pointedly. He's like, see, everything is just cyclical. Everything just keeps happening over and over again. There's nothing new. There's nothing, and nothing ever brings us to that place where we can be satisfied. This is the nature of creation as it is. And I want to get into this. All right, let's talk about this for just a second. Again, I keep throwing you questions that I didn't prepare you for. So God's creation is good, but there is this idea of like things just keep cycling over, and there is the everydayness of life. And so how do we embrace what he's saying, and maybe this is the same question. Maybe I'm just re-asking a question that you already answered. And maybe we're going to answer this question over and over and over again in this podcast of how we live in this tension of like, there is this reality of the world works in such a way, and it just seems to keep repeating itself. But God's creation is good, and God's creation is meant to be flourished and thrive in. And yet this idea of it will never satisfy us.
Yeah, I mean, you already kind of answered it in that. I think my answer would be the same in that I think you hold things loosely. I think if you start with the understanding, as you alluded to, God is the good creator who has given us all these things. When you look at Genesis chapter 1, everything created, he said, it is good. So our world is good in that, in its original intention. It's beautiful. Obviously, it's fractured. It's not all that it will be one day, and it's not what it was at one time in the beginning because of sin, because things have been corrupted. But God is still gracious. I mean, Jesus talks about this, right? He makes the sun rise, and he makes it rain on the just and the unjust. In this, we're all in this human experience. We might call it common grace, right? The common grace of God that we all get to experience. Even the atheist or the person who says, I want nothing to do with Jesus, gets to experience lots of good things in this world. But there is this element of it that it, never can fully satisfy. It is pointing back to the only one who can. It's this reminder of, I'm the one who, it's the idea that the gifts can never be better than the giver, right? If you think things in this world are so good, well, how much better is the one who gave them to us? So they're ultimately always pointing us back to them. But I think when you live out this tension, one of the things that for me personally, I can only speak for myself, is that when things don't go my way and when things are dissatisfying to me, it brings me back to my realization of my need for God and what this is all really about. So there's some sense in if things in this world were fully satisfying, we would very quickly run away from God and say, God, I don't need you. So it's almost a grace of God in that God has limited the amount in which we are able to experience goodness and joy from created things, because there's always that internal longing drawing us back to him. And so for me, I've been grateful for the moments. None of us like suffering. None of us like when things are inconvenient. None of us like when things don't go the way we want them to go. But when I look back at my life, there are so many times where I could say, I'm so thankful because God allowed that. It did something in me, right? It changed me. It changed my perspective. Or as you said, it brought me back to that funeral moment of, this is what life is supposed to be about. I need to reassess continuously. And that's something I think we should always be doing because it's easy to forget. And so we need those reminders.
Yeah. So let me ask this question then. So, because we're kind of kicking around like this very similar thought process. Why do you think that we are so bent on making, and I've heard it termed this way, majoring in the minors or making secondary things ultimate. And what I would say is making good things godly things, like the ultimate things. Why do you think that is? Why is that such a thing that we do? I mean, because the example that I think of, and he actually even gives it here, is this idea of we don't remember those that went before us, and we're not going to be remembered one day. When I think about that, like that is a horrifying concept to me.
Sure.
Why does that unnerve us so much as human beings that hunger stays there?
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's like this great sense of we want control too, where it's scary to give control over to God ultimately. But like the encouraging part about this passage is like there's nothing surprising to God. Like everything repeats itself, everything's cyclical. He's not surprised by what's going on today, and today is not any worse than a previous generation. And I talk with parents all the time of our students. It's just like, well, today's teenagers are just, worse off than we. And it's like it's all the same thing. It's a different pace, but it's all the same thing. And God's not surprised by it.
Yeah.
And so like the comfort of this is that we can take everything that we see that's so off in our world, the things that we struggle with to grapple with like this. It's like no, He's not surprised by it, and he knows what He's doing.
Yeah.
But we have to take ourselves out of that picture and say I'm not in control and surrender that to God, which is, I think for me is one of the hardest things because I want to. And I want to be unique and I want to build something for myself. But like you said, like we're not trying to build our kingdom here. Like it's not about the things that I build. It's about what God is trying to build, His kingdom come.
Yeah, I think the way that God has created us is that we have a deep longing for purpose. Like there is a deep desire within us, whether we've been able to put our finger on it or not, that we want significance. We want to be a part of something greater than ourselves, which is why sometimes the mundane of life is so difficult because it feels like, man, like I'm not doing anything significant. So I think that's one of the mechanisms that God has placed within us. I think it's actually Ecclesiastes 3. It says, God has put eternity in our hearts, depending on what translation. So there's this almost longing for something transcendent, longing for something beyond ourselves. And so one of the things that we do is if God is not in His rightful place in our lives, is we try to find that significance through building our own kingdoms and empires to say, look at me, look at what I'm doing. But the sobering reality is in 3 or 4 generations, you will be forgotten. Nobody will know who you are. I mean, even like you think of someone like an Elon Musk, right, who has done so many incredible things with Tesla. Like 3 or 4 generations, he will be a name on a history book somewhere. Nobody will know anything about him.
Yeah.
That might be horrifying. But again, if you look at it through the lens of what God is doing and what the purpose of human life is really all about, it is that sobering reminder of, okay, then what really matters?
Yeah.
Is it making a name for myself? Or in my opinion, and what I would say all of us would agree on, it's lifting up the name of Jesus. It's furthering the kingdom of God. That, as Paul says in Colossians 3:1, that which is eternal, not temporary. So to me, those things are hard to deal with, but it's the grace of God in the midst of that to say that's not what life is really all about. So there's a reason why these things are disappointing. There's a reason why that's a startling reality that a few generations from now, even in your own family, you probably won't be known. I remember seeing somebody post this on Facebook, and it sounds very blunt and very brutal almost, but it was this idea of, it said, preach the gospel, die, be forgotten. And like, I was like, man, there's a part of me that hates that, but there's a part of me that's like, that is wisdom in that it's what they were saying is tell the world about Jesus, tell the world about the good news, die, be forgotten. Like this is not about you. Forget it's that self-forgetfulness,
Yeah, I think you're hitting on stuff though that like people are like, meh, nope.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not an
like
easy thing by any means.
Yeah, I mean, I think about even in my own life, like just this entire concept and how often I have driven myself to a place of beyond what God would want in search of to either be satisfied or to find and for lack of better terms, to immortalize myself.
Yeah.
So that this doesn't happen. You know what I mean? And so like, because what is that? Like there's that very real need to feel significant.
Yeah.
That statement makes us feel insignificant.
100%.
But the reality is that need, which is a very real need, that like you said, the author of Ecclesiastes stems on that, like the idea of finding significance, of mattering to somebody, of being important, like of having identity.
Yeah.
All of those things are really rooted in the way that God created us. but they're only answered in who God is.
Yeah.
And they're only answered in the things that God like the ways
Absolutely.
that God has for us. And so like that's the part where I think what this wrestling does is it brings us back to that place of going, that's a very real need I have, but it can only be found in Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's like this. It's challenging because it's like, no, we're not meant to just sit and do nothing. Then it's like, well, everything's meaningless. So I'm not going to work. I'm not going to
Live a life of
anything.
apathy.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah. It's like, no, that actually gives us a greater purpose. That this is not about me. This is something so much bigger. This is an eternal calling that I have, and so I am going to do everything in my power to work hard at what God has called me to. But at the end of the day, I'm not getting the glory like God is.
And doesn't it take the pressure off?
Yeah.
Just
Like,
gonna say,
100%.
it narrows the scope to focus on the things that matter. Like I was thinking even about the concept of like generational legacy. I am not like, I don't have to make a name for myself so that people 10 generations from now know me. What I'm accountable for is, am I loving my wife? Am I loving my kids? Am I loving the people of this church that God has entrusted to me? Am I taking the opportunities God has given me to love people well and point them to Jesus in my words and in my deeds? That's what I'm accountable to.
So that they pass on to their generations.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not your name, but Jesus' name.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think even you were hinting at this, the idea so often it comes down to identity is so important, but we're trying to self-construct our own identity through these means of significance, right?
Yeah.
So if I build a business empire, if I make a lot of money, if I have a nice house, look at my significance, look at what I've done.
Yeah.
But it is vanity. It is meaningless.
Right.
Number one, because 3 generations, nobody will know you, but also because at a personal level, we know it won't satisfy. It can
Right.
never really, it's like the goal line is always moving, you know?
Like,
And
oh,
so
man.
it's a couple things. It's just the sobering reality that yes, you will be forgotten no matter what you do, that you will be a footnote somewhere in the history books, even with the greatest of accomplishments. But secondly, you're wasting your life in a way that you're pursuing things that can never satisfy you and never will.
Yeah. And I don't want to jump off that thought, but Micah, you said something earlier and you talked about it, and I don't want to breeze past it because I think it is really important, and it really stems it back. It brings us back to the theme of what the book of Ecclesiastes is trying to do. You said you have parents who say, like, things are worse now than what they were when I was in.
Yeah.
And we glorify generations, and we glorify like our ideal of, like, I think we do it with the 50s and the 40s, and we say like this is the golden era, like,
Sure.
like, and yeah, there might be some good things about it, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
like things that were different, but I think you hit on something important in the idea that everything is recurring, and it stems back to the same temptation that Adam and Eve had. Will we trust God to fulfill us in these things? Will we trust God to find His way, His path to life, or will we fail to trust Him and seek after it? And that is the temptation that sets before Adam and Eve. It's the temptation that sat before Abraham. It's the temptation that sat before Jesus. And you know what I mean? And every single person, every single human being for all of history is left to face this decision. Will I trust God to find life, to find fulfillment, to find everything that I need, or will I try to satisfy it on my own?
Yeah.
So any other closing thoughts or any other questions that come to your mind as you're thinking about this concept of Ecclesiastes? And I know we didn't answer everything today, but I really feel like we laid a great foundation for what this book's going to be. So you guys have anything else that comes to mind?
I just would say one thing, and it's going back to the beginning of kind of introducing this book and the themes of talking about things that are hard or depressing or sobering. I think what we need to do a better job at as a society, particularly as Americans and even more particularly as American Christians, is to have a more robust worldview and a more realistic worldview. We need to open ourselves to these types of conversations. I think so much of our lives is built on, humor and levity and entertainment because we don't want to dive into the harder, deeper questions of life. But if we want to become all that God has created us to be, and if we want to be able to face life as it is, as reality really is, I think we have to have these conversations, and we have to be reminded of that.
I was just going to say, so the numbness that you feel when we were reading 3 through 8, the numbness that creates, that cyclical, that just kind of repeating. I heard Matt Chandler describe it as the treadmill at times. In ways that is therapeutic to us because we don't know what to do with these things.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it just goes back to that trust then too. Like, am I willing to things that do feel new and do feel crazy that are going on? Can we say like keep coming back to that? I don't know. Like, he's not surprised by it. Like this
Yeah,
is not a
yeah.
surprise to him, and maybe it is to me. But in my humanness, like, am I going to seek wisdom in it, and I'm going to seek the next right thing to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much for this conversation, and thank you all for listening. I hope that you're. I'm going to use the term excited loosely. We're never really excited to do the real work of looking at our hearts and looking at what we value. It can be difficult. It can be not fun. I'll say it that way. But it is necessary, like what you said, Anthony. And I think it's going to be so beneficial for us as we go through this book, for us to take the time and to really sit in this place of evaluating our lives. And so I pray that as you listen to these studies and as you come through this book of Ecclesiastes, what it does is it gives you those moments and you take those times and just begin to evaluate your life in light of eternity, in light of who Jesus is, and in light of what Jesus says has true value. And in what ways will that challenge you? And what ways will it change your life? And so I pray that this study is life-changing for you, even though it may not be the most fun, but that it transforms you and changes you. So we hope that you'll join us next week and that you will continue to process through the book of Ecclesiastes with us here on the Tree.Church Bible Study. Have a great week.